You ever feel like you're being watched, but you can't tell who's watching you? That was me, sitting in Tyrese's old family house in Homewood, Pittsburgh. The laughter inside the living room was easy and loud, a mix of voices and stories flying around, like we'd all known each other forever. His eldest son, Marcus, had his arms slung over his wife's shoulder, their kids darting around the couch like a little whirlwind. It was cozy, chaotic, and everything I imagined when Tyrese talked about bringing me home. It should have been one of those picture-perfect family moments, but my attention kept slipping away. Out on the front lawn, through the window, there was Keith, Tyrese's youngest. He was standing by the grill, one hand flipping sausages, the other gripping a beer like it was his lifeline. He was nothing like the rest of them. Where they were open and warm, Keith was guarded, reserved, that kind of quiet confidence that makes you want to figure out what's going on inside their head. He had on a plain navy blue shirt and jeans, his back slightly turned, but when he'd glanced toward the house, his sharp features caught the fading sunlight just right, like he was carved out of stone. I don't know what it was about him, but I kept looking, not in a creepy way, at least I don't think so, but I couldn't stop myself. And then Tyrese laughed, loud and booming, his hand nudging my knee. "You see that, Harper?" I blinked, realizing the room had erupted into laughter, everyone looking at me. I froze. Yeah, that was hilarious. Tyrese raised an eyebrow, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Oh yeah? Then tell me what I said." Oh no, my mind scrambled for something, anything. The room went quiet, every eye locked on me, waiting. I felt my cheeks go hot as I stammered. "You said, that thing about the barbecue." The room exploded into laughter again, but this time at me, not with me. Tyrese shook his head, still grinning. "Harper, you weren't listening for a second, were you?" I laughed along, waving it off, but inside I felt strange, guilty maybe. I stole another glance out the window at Keith, who was still working the grill, oblivious to the scene inside. Dinner that evening felt like a milestone, but I couldn't shake the lingering awkwardness from earlier. Tyrese, my husband, was. He used to come into my hairdressing shop every other week. It started with small talk, then turned into longer conversations, and before I knew it, we'd connected over our shared experiences. Both divorced, both looking for a fresh start. It wasn't some whirlwind romance. It was safe, steady, and comforting. Now here we were, just back from our honeymoon, sitting in his family's ancestral home in Homewood. It was my first time meeting the people who knew him, long before I ever did. Tyrese had just come in from the grill, a tray of perfectly charred ribs and sausages in his hands. He set it on the table with that easy confidence of his, the kind that makes you feel like everything's under control. "This is Keith," my husband said, nodding toward the younger man as we sat down. Keith offered a quick handshake, his grip firm but brief, before retreating into his silence. He barely spoke, just a polite ma'am, when I said it was nice to meet him. He sat across from me, focused on his plate, like the conversation wasn't for him. The barbecue was delicious. Tyrese hadn't been exaggerating when he called Keith a master at the grill, but as the laughter and chatter floated around the table, my attention kept wandering, and then it happened. The glass of white wine tipped over, spilling onto my dress. "Oh crap," my husband said, jumping up. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." I wasn't sure if I'd knocked it over accidentally or not. Either way, I ended up in the hallway, where Tyrese's older son's wife handed me a dress to change into. "You'll look great in this," she said with a warm smile. I slipped into the bathroom, changing quickly, but as I stepped out, I froze. Keith was there, standing in the hallway. We locked eyes, his dark, unreadable, mine probably wide with surprise. He didn't say a word, just looked at me for a beat too long before walking past. His movement steady, deliberate. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding, and made my way back to the dining room, my thoughts a jumbled mess. There was something about him, like a magnet pulling my focus, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. By the time I got back, the meal was winding down, plates were cleared, and the kids had disappeared to play somewhere else. We moved into the living room, the adults sinking into worn leather couches and armchairs. A week passed, life settling back into its usual rhythm. Tyrese was back at the mechanic shop he ran in the city, and I had the house to myself for the morning. It was quiet, just the hum of the neighborhood, a few birds in the trees. I was on the porch, a mug of coffee in hand, letting the crisp, point breeze air wake me up. Then I heard it, the low rumble of a motorcycle approaching. I squinted toward the street, watching as it slowed to a stop in front of our house. The rider was wearing a helmet, so I couldn't see who it was at first, but when they pulled it off, my stomach did a little flip. It was Keith. That same wave of something, curiosity, tension, whatever it was, hit me just like it had in Homewood. He looked even more striking in the daylight, his sharp jawline catching the sun, his dark eyes scanning the porch before landing on me. "Mom," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he walked up the path toward me. "How are you? I came here to meet Dad." His voice was calm, casual, but there was something about the way he said it that made my heart race. I straightened up, trying to shake the strange energy that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Keith," I said, setting my coffee down, "your dad's at the shop right now. He won't be back until later." "That's fine," he said, leaning against the porch railing like he had all the time in the world. "Mind if I wait?" "Sure. Let me grab something for you," I quickly said. I got up and went into the kitchen, grabbing a cold beer from the fridge. When I came back, I tossed it to Keith, and he caught it easily, twisting off the cap and taking a sip. He leaned back in the porch chair, settling in, and for a moment, the silence between us wasn't so heavy. "So," I said, trying to sound casual, "what do you do, Keith?" He shrugged, looking out at the street. "Hustle here and there." I wanted to ask more. What kind of hustle? What are your dreams? What's your story? But I didn't want to come on too strong. Still, something about his answer tugged at me. Tyrese and I lived a comfortable life here in Point Breeze, surrounded by manicured lawns and polished cars, but I knew that wasn't Keith's reality. "You don't have to act all reserved around me," I said, offering a smile. "I'm not here to judge you." That seemed to loosen him up a bit. He glanced at me, a flicker of gratitude in his expression. "Well," he said, "I get by. Some daily wage jobs, cleaning gigs, pizza deliveries, whatever comes my way." I felt a pang of sorrow at how casual he made it sound, like this was all he expected from life. "Do you know your way around a computer?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm pretty good at the basics." That gave me an idea. "I can help you find something more permanent," I said, sitting up straighter. "I've got some connections. A steady job might be better than all that hustling." He looked at me, surprised but hopeful. "You do that?" "Of course," I said, smiling. "You deserve a shot at something stable." We talked a little longer, the conversation growing easier, and when Tyrese's truck finally pulled into the driveway, Keith and I were sitting comfortably, laughing about something I'd said. When Tyrese walked up, I didn't waste time. "Why didn't you tell me Keith was struggling?" I asked, catching him off guard. Tyrese glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable. "It's my problem, Harper. You don't need to worry about that." But I shook my head. "No, it's our problem, and I'm taking care of it." Tyrese sighed, but didn't argue further. Keith, for his part, looked between us, his expression unreadable. The next morning, I called an old friend who worked at a law office and asked if they needed help around the place. Basic tasks, computer work, filing. By the end of the day, Keith had an interview lined up, and later on, he was officially hired. It felt good to help him, but deep down, I couldn't ignore how happy it made me to see that flicker of excitement in his eyes. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Tyrese already snoring softly beside me. It had only been a month since we got married, and for all intents and purposes, I should have been happy. He was kind, dependable, everything a woman could ask for in a second chance at love. Tonight, something felt off. As we'd been intimate earlier, I couldn't help but notice the distance. It wasn't Tyrese's fault. He tried, bless him, but I couldn't feel the spark. Not like I used to imagine love should feel. Maybe it was because I kept picturing Keith, his rugged frame and quiet intensity so different from Tyrese's soft, steady presence. I turned my head to look at him, his face peaceful in the dim light. Wrinkles lined his cheeks. His hair had thinned over the years, and he let out a little snore as he shifted. And who was I to judge? I wasn't any younger, with my silver hair and my own share of creases. Still, I couldn't ignore the creeping doubt. Had I married Tyrese because I loved him, or because he felt like a safe harbor in the storm of getting older? He was a good man, but that nagging sense of something missing wouldn't let me rest. I sighed quietly, careful not to wake him, and turned onto my side. Keith's image lingered in my mind, his sharp jawline, and the way his eyes seemed to pierce through the noise. It was ridiculous, of course, completely inappropriate, and yet I couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. The next morning, after Tyrese had left for his mechanic shop, I found myself feeling restless. Keith had been on my mind since last night, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to check in on him at his new job. It wasn't just curiosity. I wanted to see how he was settling in, how he was handling a steady gig for the first time. I grabbed my keys and slid into my vintage Corvette, the engine roaring to life. As I drove through the city, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and nerves. When I arrived at the law office, the sleek glass doors and polished floors greeted me, a stark contrast to the dusty mechanic shop where Tyrese spent his days. My old friend, the one who'd hired Keith, greeted me warmly. "Harper," he said, shaking my hand. "Always good to see you. And hey, thanks for sending Keith our way. He's a good lad, hardworking, sharp. We're glad to have him." Hearing that made my chest swell with pride. "I knew he'd do well," I said with a smile. "Thanks again for giving him the opportunity." As we talked, my gaze drifted across the hall where I saw Keith in a small cabin. He was seated at a desk, focused on something, and even from a distance, I could see how poised he looked. When he glanced up and noticed me, he stood, his posture straight and confident. It wasn't until I walked closer that I realized just how striking he looked. He was in a three-piece suit, every detail immaculate. The transformation stunned me. Gone was the laid-back young man from Homewood. In his place was someone who looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not hustling odd jobs. "Harper," he said with a smile, stepping out from behind his desk. "I can't thank you enough for this." "No need to thank me," I said, feeling a playful edge creep into my voice. "Maybe keep your thanks on hold. I might need a favor from you one day." That caught him off guard, and he chuckled, his smile widening. "Fair enough. I owe you one." I sat down across from him, letting the conversation flow. There was something light-hearted and easy between us, banter that felt natural, almost too natural. "So, how are you liking the suit and tie life?" I teased. He leaned back slightly, his confidence evident. "It's different, but I like it. Feels good to have something steady for once." "Good," I said, nodding, "because you wear it well." I caught the way Keith's eyes dipped, lingering on the neckline of my dress. It wasn't subtle, but it wasn't overt either. It was that flicker of a gaze, like a hesitation he hadn't meant to reveal. And I could feel it, like a warm, fleeting touch. Before the moment had a chance to turn awkward, I leaned forward slightly, a teasing smile on my lips. "What's on your mind, Keith?" He startled, his head snapping up as if I'd caught him red-handed. His eyes darted to the floor, and he cleared his throat. "I was just thinking about Marcus's birthday party," he said, a touch too quickly. "I need to get melons for little Jabari. He loves those fruit salads his mom makes." I blinked, caught so off guard by the randomness of his response that I couldn't hold back. A laugh burst out of me, uncontrollable, almost hysterical. It bubbled up from somewhere deep and filled the small office space. Keith's eyes widened in surprise, his cheeks flushing a deep red. He looked half embarrassed, half confused, which only made me laugh harder. "What's so funny?" he finally asked, his eyebrows knitting together like he genuinely couldn't understand what had set me off. I took a deep breath, holding my stomach as I tried to regain some composure. "It's just... melons? For a birthday party?" I managed to gasp out between fits of laughter. "That's the last thing I would have expected you to say right now." A slow grin spread across his face, and he started to chuckle, his earlier tension melting away. "I know, right? But the kid's obsessed with them, and if it keeps him from sticking his fingers in the cake before everyone arrives, it's worth it." That set me off again, and soon we were both laughing, the kind of laughter that leaves you breathless and lightheaded. The whole thing was absurd, and yet it felt oddly perfect. The air between us shifted, a subtle tension hanging in the space like an unspoken secret. We both acted as if everything was casual, innocent even, but inside, we both knew there was more. The words hung between us like a silent confession we weren't ready to make. When I asked Keith when he'd be free, he said PM without hesitation. I told him, Feel free to come by our house anytime, it's just a short ride from here. He smiled, the way he did when he was playing it cool, and replied, I'd love that. There was something in the way he said it that felt loaded, and yet we both pretended like nothing had changed. I stood up, giving him a quick hug before I left. The moment was brief, but it left me breathless, a weird electric charge pulsing between us. Something shifted in that hug, something I couldn't put into words. Later I went home, tried to shake the feeling, and focused on making dinner. When Tyrese arrived, as expected, he was being romantic, making sweet comments, his usual affectionate self. It was still our honeymoon period, so I should have been enjoying the attention, basking in the affection. But for some reason, I felt distant. His jokes, his flirty remarks, they all seemed to fall flat in my mind. I gave him short, polite replies, just enough to keep the conversation going, but nothing heartfelt. Are you all right? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. Yeah, just a little tired, I said, feeling a pang of guilt, and not entirely sure I believed my own words. I went to the room and fell asleep. The next evening, I was in the middle of my usual yoga session when the doorbell rang around 5:30 p.m., and my heart skipped a beat. I practically leapt to the door, half hoping it was Keith, and sure enough, there he was. I scolded myself quietly for being so eager, but I couldn't help it. Hey Harper, what's poppin'? Dad home? He said with that easygoing tone, just like he always did. No, he'll be here soon, I replied, trying to sound casual. I was wearing my sweaty yoga gear as Keith looked me up and down with a smirk. Oh, so you do workout? That's the secret to your perfect shape, huh? His flirtatious comment caught me off guard, and I couldn't help but flush. I playfully shot back, well, you know, just trying to stay fit. I invited him in, trying to act normal despite the heat creeping up my neck. Make yourself at home. Give me minutes to finish up my workout, all right? I excused myself, trying to regain my composure, and went back into the living room where my yoga mat was set up. I started my favorite poses, Bitalasana and Ananda Balasana, feeling a sense of calm wash over me as I stretched. But then I noticed him. Keith had quietly walked up behind me, watching me intently. His gaze felt like it was seeping into my skin. I know yoga too, he said, his voice low but confident. You need to work on your posing. I glanced back, surprised by his sudden proximity. He was standing so close now, and I could feel his warmth. Without waiting for me to respond, he gently adjusted my posture. You should hold your back a bit more like this, he said, his hands guiding my form. I could hardly focus on the stretch, my mind swirling with the closeness, the sensation of dynamic, and how easily he slipped into my space without any hesitation. It was all so familiar, yet so new. As Keith helped me with my yoga poses, I couldn't help but notice how his shirt clung to his chest, the muscles flexing every time he moved. He had this focused look on his face, beads of sweat trickling down his forehead, and his eyes, man, his eyes, were locked on me in a way that made my heart skip a beat. I wasn't sure what to do with all the feelings rushing through me. It was like everything I'd been ignoring came crashing in all at once. But then I knew exactly what I had to do. I sat up, our eyes meeting, and I just couldn't help myself. I closed the gap between us. Everything else seemed to fade away, and it felt like it was just the two of us. Keith, I don't know why, but I can't resist the urge to be closer to you right now, I said, not really thinking, just feeling. Before he could say anything, I pressed myself against him. And let me tell you, it wasn't like any kiss I'd ever had. It was raw, real, and everything we'd both been holding back. We tumbled around on that yoga mat, no words, just action. It was like we both knew this moment couldn't last forever, but we didn't care. Time was ticking away, but it didn't matter. We were in our own little world. Then, out of nowhere, we heard the rumble of Tyrese's truck pulling into the driveway. I swear, it was like the universe was trying to remind us of what we already knew, that reality was about to crash back in. I pulled away first, my heart racing, and I scrambled to get dressed. We rushed to put ourselves together, but it was like the clock was mocking us. We both knew what had just happened, and there was no way to erase it. When Tyrese walked through the door, I forced a smile, hoping he wouldn't see how freaked out I was. Hey babe, look who stopped by today, I said, trying to act like everything was normal. Tyrese smiled, surprised but happy to see Keith. They exchanged pleasantries, but I could barely focus. My mind was a whirlwind. Keith didn't stick around long. He said he had to go, and I watched him leave with this tight feeling in my chest. Now I was alone with Tyrese, and guilt started to hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt like I'd done something I couldn't take back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. But I had to smile through it, pretend everything was fine. The truth? I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore,